The Final Fantasy series is a series that has been around for a long time in the gaming world. It is a series that sparked my love of RPGs early on in my life. With the release of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster collection on consoles, I've started a mission to go through as many of the Final Fantasy series of games as I can. Here I wind up closing the chapter on the Famicom era of the Final Fantasy games with Final Fantasy III. This entry was one I had never played before now, as it was originally only released in Japan. Did it wind up pushing the series forward for an impressive conclusion to this era, or did it wind up being a bit disappointing? Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster is a turn-based RPG developed by Square Enix. The Pixel Remaster version was released in 2021 for mobile and PC, and in 2023 for PS4 and Nintendo Switch. The original version of Final Fantasy III was released in 1990 for the Famicom. Again, it didn't come over to the NES in the United States, it was only released in Japan. Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster costs $17.99 on all storefronts. The game is also rated E10, which makes it a game that is suitable for most anyone to play. Final Fantasy III's story inspiration is more from the first entry in the series than the second. While I do enjoy the return of the crystals to the narrative, this was done in a way that felt like a big step backward from the narrative of the second game. You're just kind of thrown into the narrative without much of any setup at all. You're dropped into the story as 4 orphans exploring a cave opened by an earthquake. They find the Crystal of Wind while they're exploring the cave, which grants them power and a set of jobs they can change to. The crystal also sets them on a quest to restore balance to the world. Not given much more than that, the heroes then set off tackling obstacle after obstacle on their journey to save the world. I felt like the story just didn't grab me here. It does flesh the story out a bit more later on and adds a little bit more to it other than just, here, go on a quest to save the world, but it wasn't really enough to make the story feel compelling to me. It also tries to make it seem like there's a little bit more of a story by having some named companions that join your group, kind of along the lines of Final Fantasy II, but they don't actually join your group or fight with you, which I also kind of feel makes them not quite as developed as some of the ones that you run into in Final Fantasy II. And this didn't really work because even with these characters, I never really felt any emotional investment, and it just felt rushed overall. The game has you moving from crisis to crisis without a lot of things feeling very connected to one another. To be honest, I felt like the story of the first game was a bit better paced and presented than this one was. Maybe this was just due to the fact that I was more familiar with the first Final Fantasy, but I'm not really sure that that's all that's going on here. Because both of them do have a more scaled back narrative that focuses a little bit more on exploration than heavy story. But even with that, I feel like the Final Fantasy III, with all of its attempts to have characters that join your group for a little bit and the villains that are presented, I never found any of them as memorable as the characters or villains from either of the previous games, from 1 or 2. And this just disappointed me because the narrative of Final Fantasy II was a big step forward on the narrative front. So to have Final Fantasy III take such a big step backward in story was something that I was sad to see. The story of Final Fantasy III may have been a bit disappointing for me, but the gameplay is still solid. There isn't a whole lot new in the base gameplay. You go around exploring cities, towns, and various dungeons, buying equipment, fighting monsters, and solving the various problems the location you're currently at is having. Battles are still a standard turn-based structure and function in much the same way that they have for both the first and second games in the series. While Final Fantasy II took leveling in a very different direction in increasing your stats through what you did in combat, Final Fantasy III returns the series to a straight experience point system. Once you gain so many experience points, you gain a character level and gain stats from that level up. While I do think the Final Fantasy II system was interesting, this way is just much more straightforward and requires less of a grind in my opinion. Now the major addition here in Final Fantasy III is the job system. In Final Fantasy I, you were able to choose your party setup from a number of different jobs at the start of the game, but once you picked your party, that job would stay the same with only the ability to upgrade that job into its advanced form later in the game. Final Fantasy III takes that idea and allows you to have party members swap jobs anytime you want to. You will also gain more types of jobs as you progress through the game and find the various crystals. Overall, it's a fun system that allows for as much or as little flexibility as you want. You want a pretty standard melee and magic mix? That will be very easy to accomplish. You want to try out some of the more unique jobs? Then you can do that too. Depending on your party makeup, it may make things a bit more challenging, but you can still do it. I did enjoy the system, but it didn't always feel the most straightforward. Each job also has a leveling system of its its own, but it was often unclear what these levels really did or how much more powerful the levels made each of the jobs. This often made me hesitant to swap jobs too much because I wasn't sure what I was losing when changing out a higher level job that I've been enjoying for a shiny new one that I just got. Sometimes there were jobs that were obviously an upgrade in terms of a melee or magic option, but other times it was a bit more unclear if the new job was going to be better than what you had already been using. Now, there were also a couple of other additions in terms of gameplay that were kind of interesting and worth a mention. The first is that Final Fantasy III marks the first Final Fantasy game with summons. There were certain jobs that were able to use summoning magic, and while this didn't play a huge role in the game, summons would go on to become a major component of the Final Fantasy series, and here is where it starts. The other isn't exactly new, but the direction they went in Final Fantasy III was more expansive, and this is the modes of transportation. The series has always had multiple ways to travel, like canoes, ships, and usually the ultimate transportation in the game, the airship. Final Fantasy III presented all of these, but also had 4 different airships over the course of the game, and most of these had some kind of special ability assigned with them. One was able to land on water and also be used as a normal ship. One was able to go against high-speed winds and was also later able to be utilized as a submarine. And the last one had shops inside of it, a place to rest, and could pass over certain mountain peaks. This made the transportation interesting, but it also increased complexity. Having to swap airships to get the right one to go to a certain location wasn't always that enjoyable to do. It felt like just kind of unnecessary steps in the game and felt more like a way to wall off certain areas of the game than it did to really add something all that meaningful. As with all of the Pixel Remastered versions, there are plenty of extras and features to use here to turn off random encounters, give a boost to levels or gold, or just access information like bestiaries or music players. While some of the games felt like the boosts were needed to escape the grind, I never really found that to be the case in Final Fantasy III. They're there if you want them, but I never found myself needing to use them, even in order to get the Platinum Trophy in the PlayStation 4 version. Overall, I found the gameplay here really good. The solid foundation of turn-based battles remains solid, the return of experience-based leveling is welcome, and the new job system is interesting, even if it wasn't always clear how the different jobs progressed. It definitely presents the most solid gameplay experience of the first 3 games, but I definitely felt like there was still room for improvement. As I've said in my previous 2 reviews on the Pixel Remaster series, I really enjoy the pixel art style and how the collection has updated the look of these games. They are worlds better than the original releases, but are not so different that they lose the feel of that era of Final Fantasy. It may not wow you if you compare them to more modern games, even more modern pixel games, but the art style is solid and I really enjoy it. The Final Fantasy games are also known for their music. Admittedly, since I haven't played Final Fantasy III before, I don't know the music quite as much. There are songs that sound similar to previous entries like the battle themes and the victory fanfare. There are also some great songs like the map theme and the first theme for a character in the series, which was for the Priestess of the Water Crystal. While there were some good songs, I must admit that I don't know how many really stuck with me the way that some of the other Final Fantasy songs have over the years. I have never really had any issues with the Pixel Remaster series of games, and Final Fantasy III continues that trend. It runs smooth, had no crashes, and there's just nothing to really report here. Final Fantasy III is an interesting entry in the series. It swings back to normal on the gameplay side after Final Fantasy tried something a bit different that didn't really work the best. My biggest problem with it is that it also felt like it swung back a bit too far in terms of story as well. It tries to keep some aspects of the second game with named characters that follow your group around for a time, but they always felt like a solution to a problem more than a character with any kind of depth to them. The job system is a fun addition to the game as well, but it doesn't make up for a disappointing story. The job system is also a bit vague and bare bones as well, which makes it not as good as it could be. It makes it a nice addition, but isn't quite enough to push the game into greatness. With all of these factors in play, I give Final Fantasy III a 7 out of 10. Final Fantasy III isn't a bad game by any means. At the end of the day, it just never really grabbed a hold of me with its lack of narrative strength. I'd probably consider it the weakest of the Famicom era of the series overall. Even so, it adds some fun elements that become staples of the series going forward. It may wind up being a bit of a disappointing end to the Famicom era of Final Fantasy for me, but I do still think it is worth a look.